it's Zainab.
And it's Tara.
And welcome back to another Law and Disorder episode today. This is episode 2, and we have a very exciting case planned for you today.
So we chose this case for a multitude of reasons. So firstly, I usually cover the psychology aspect of the cases. So I found this really interesting because this case is so ahead of its time. It's primarily about a woman killing her abusive husband, which I just thought was so interesting, and I wanted to know about the psychology behind how love can turn so violent.
So I picked this case because one of my niches, I obviously want to do law in the future. One of my niches is how systematic inequalities like race and gender and class affect outcomes in the criminal justice system. So in this case, for example, Ruth Ellis was a woman, and I feel like that largely and greatly impacted her sentence and is the reason why she got the death penalty. I feel like if she was a man, then it would not have the same outcome. And I just found that very interesting how these inequalities and these aspects that you cannot control generally do affect the justice system as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and as well as that, we both found this case really interesting because it's an older case. I mean, it contrasts to the case we just did, which was the Richardson family murders, and that was set in the 2000s. So this is all the way from the 1950s, you guys.
And this one is set in the UK, so it's set in London. And so because this is an older case, it may have a few inaccuracies just because it was really hard to find material. But I think that we have a really interesting story to narrate. So let's get into the background info. So Ruth Ellis first met David Blakely in 1953 when she was managing a nightclub in London. So Blakely was this charming, wealthy race car driver, but he was also known for his heavy drinking and volatile temperament. And their relationship quickly became intense, but was also characterized by extreme highs and lows.
I think it's also really important to notice that before this, Ruth had also been previously married, and she had 2 children, and one of them still lived with her ex-husband. However, her relationship with Blakely was marked by intense desire and passion, but also frequent arguments and physical violence. Blakely himself was possessive and jealous and just a very small-minded man, and Ellis was just passionate, and she was so emotionally invested into this relationship, you guys. It was everything she ever wanted. She wanted to work so well, and she went at such great lengths to keep the relationship going. Despite all of the flaws, all of Blakely's arguments, and all of his violence, she wanted to make it work so desperately.
And Blakely was extremely unfaithful, and he reportedly had affairs with other women during their relationship, which further fueled these conflicts between them in their marriage. Ellis herself became increasingly volatile, and their fights often turned violent. She suffered emotional abuse at his hands, but there were also reports of her retaliating, which I thought was really, progressive of her time. In the 1950s, this was such unusual behavior.
It shows signs that she's not like the other women. Like she's not like other girls, but she's not like, she doesn't fit the submissive suburban housewife.
She doesn't align with the kind of ideals at the time, which I thought was really interesting about her character. And despite this, Ellis seemed deeply attached to Blakely and was devastated by his infidelities and erratic behavior.
Their relationship continued to deteriorate when Blakely then began to distance himself from Ellis. She felt abandoned. I mean, in the days leading up to the shooting, she became distraught. She was drinking alcohol. She was just in despair, and she was just so upset over how their relationship ended. She tried so hard, you guys. She was such an emotionally invested person. She wanted it to work so badly, and she just couldn't help. She didn't know what she did to make her husband act this way.
She blamed herself, really.
Why was he doing this? I mean, why was he going out and cheating on her? Why was he distancing herself from her? It must have been her fault, right? She had to have done something. She has to fix it. That's all that was going through her mind leading up to the shooting, and that's kind of her emotions, these emotions of guilt and fear and just despair and anger, and all these emotions all accumulated and led to the tragic events on Easter Sunday in 1955 when Ruth Ellis shot Blakely outside a pub in Hampstead.
So let's get into detail about the actual day itself. So on Easter Sunday, April 10th, 1955, Ruth Ellis had encountered David Blakely in Hampstead, London. Earlier that day, Ellis had reportedly been drinking heavily and she was visibly distressed. She then took a taxi to go find Blakely and eventually spotted him outside the Magdala Tavern. that is a pub in Hampstead, where he was drinking with his friend Clive Gunnell.
So when Blakely left the pub and he began walking towards his car, his wife, Ruth Ellis, approaches him. Now, the next part is completely based off of what witnesses have said, so take it with a pinch of salt. Ruth Ellis called his name, and as he turned, she pulled out a revolver and fired the first shot. Blakely began to run, but Ellis followed, firing even more shots. In total, she fired 5 bullets. 4 struck Blakely and killed him instantly. However, one of the shots ricocheted and injured a female bystander.
What?
Although she was not fatally injured, she was fine in the end.
That's crazy, though. She was still shot.
She was still shot.
It was the 50s, so
yeah, that's just our excuse for getting... it was the 50s.
It was 50s, so let's not, get too upset. But, in all seriousness, after the shooting, Ellis did stand very calmly at the scene. She reportedly made no attempt to flee and actually waited for the police to arrive at the scene. And when they did, she handed them the gun and allegedly said, "I am guilty. I'm a little confused." That's the aura. But that's her line. That's a very famous line that comes with her case. And she was arrested on the spot and was then taken into custody.
So that's the case, you guys.
Let's first unpack those events, because I have so much to say.
I think before we get into the whole psychological and law aspect, we have to discuss, you guys,
how progressive this woman is.
We keep saying this, but it's just, think about it, guys. It's the 40s and 50s. This is a progressive society, a society of conformity. Women were meant to...
This was so, they were so conservative. They were so fixed with their views. If you think about this, because we study a book in A-level English called A Streetcar Named Desire, and that is kind of set in a very similar time, the 40s, 50s. It's set in America, set in post-war America, but I'm sure, the society kind of ideals are very similar. But everyone was very, stern, very fixed about their views. No one was liberal like this. No one would have ever thought that a woman who was being abused by her husband was then going to take revenge by shooting him.
Yeah, especially in this book, because the book centers around an abusive husband to his wife, who is pregnant. And the wife, we saw how she cannot leave because 2 things. Firstly, she's pregnant. She's
tied to him.
She needs stability. Because back then, you guys, women were not able to work that freely. And if they did, the gender pay gap was a real thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Men were the main breadwinners because that's just how it was.
And because they were the breadwinners, they were entitled to this dominance, this control, this possessiveness in their household.
Women could not leave. Women were afraid to say anything against their abusive husbands because what if they turned on them? They had every right to, apparently.
The kind of economic, financial, physical, emotional control these men had over their wives. And Ruth Ellis still
defied
all of these expectations put on her, all these pressures, all these ideals.
Before how she was a little bit assertive and she did retaliate a little bit when he did.
Yeah, even retaliating is a massive thing.
When he did hit her, she knew it was wrong. But the thing is, going up to him and shooting him, that was unheard of at the time.
And it may seem like we're kind of endorsing it, and by no means are we trying to whatsoever.
We're not saying you guys go kill your abusive husbands. That is not what we are trying to say. We're not going to share our own opinions on whether we think the shooting was the right thing to do, should it have happened, because this is a very complicated situation because the man was totally in the wrong.
He was in the wrong, but was she entitled to shooting him is a whole other argument.
She had no right
in
to
itself.
shoot him, but the thing
take his life.
We don't know the whole story. We don't
because the fact is, it is an old case. There are a lot of gaps to fill. There are a lot of witnesses, a lot of speculations, a lot of reports. We don't exactly know what happened.
We don't know if she could do anything else, you guys. Maybe this was the last resort. This is all she could do to free herself. So we can't make assumptions on that thing that we don't have the full story. But we do have to keep that in mind, that she was definitely not fully the culprit, fully. She wasn't fully in the wrong.
We can never really say who's in the wrong here, but based on what we have said, I think it's really important to acknowledge that this was extremely progressive, extremely did not align with the kind of societal norms or expectations at the time, which I thought made this case even more interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And you guys can form your own opinions on whether shooting him was the right thing to do, if that was her own
whether
escape.
it was justified or whatever. But
now I think what we should go into is our own separate niches. I think Tara and I were going to go into the psychological and law aspect. So I think Tara's going to start off with the psychology.
Yes.
So okay. Yes, let's get straight into that.
So, in relation to the context of this case, I think it's important to first understand IPV. So, this refers to any form of abuse or aggression in an intimate relationship. And this IPV stands for intimate partner violence, I'm pretty sure. And it includes 4 types of abuse in relationships. So you have physical, emotional, sexual, and economic. And I think we should note that there are several patterns of IPV in Ellis's relationship with Blakely. So you have physical violence, of course, because Blakely was known to have physically assaulted Ellis multiple times, including publicly punching her, which left visible injuries.
My goodness.
And, of course, emotional abuse, because Blakely did demonstrate controlling and humiliating behavior. Oh, absolutely. And it did include ignoring her, displaying jealousy, and using dismissive language. And he did also, cheat on her, which is a whole other kind of emotional abuse. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the kind of, economic control men had at the time in the 50s over their wives, over their household. He had undocumented societal limitations for women. And, Ellis's reliance on her nightclub job only could have exacerbated her vulnerability to Blakely's dominance, because how much money could she have been making as a woman in London in the 50s working at a nightclub? You can only expect the kind of economic dominance Blakely had over her. And IPV does follow this kind of predictable cycle of abuse that Ellis and Blakely's relationship did mirror. So you first have this tension building phase, which is when there's an escalation of conflict, verbal threats, and minor violence. Then you have an acute explosion phase. So this is when you have episodes of severe violence, physical beatings. And then after that, they go back to this honeymoon phase, which is when you have this temporary reconciliation and false hope of change.
Like Stella and Stanley.
Exactly like Stella and Stanley. That's the couple from the book. So it's kind of when you follow this cycle of you have these heated moments of violence, aggression, temper, and then you almost use desire as a means of making up with them, as a means of rebuilding what you had, as a means of maintaining that bond, rather than actually talking things out, sorting things out properly. They just kind of reconcile in some other way. And then victims of IPV do form these really psychological attachments to their abusers due to this intermittent reinforcement of affection and reconciliation in the honeymoon phase. So they start to believe oh, but it's okay because he's my husband, and at the end of the day he does love me. They have these brief moments of passion which almost make it seem worth it to go through that kind of distress. And Ellis's continued attachment to Blakely, despite his abuse, due to this intermittent reinforcement of affection and reconciliation, did lead to her continued attachment to Blakely. So, yeah, despite his abuse, this kind of suggests a form of trauma bonding, which is a very significant part of IPV, and it is a coping mechanism that's very common in IPV as well. And like Zainab said, there are extremely limited opportunities for women in the 1950s, with this huge societal stigma made around women in work, women with power, women with dominance in relationships in their household. And this made leaving the relationship even harder. She almost felt tied to him. He was almost entitled to control over her due to the society that they lived in. And I think we should also talk about some other psychological conditions arising from prolonged exposure to IPV, which is BWS, otherwise known as battered woman syndrome. So this is actually recognized as a subset of PTSD, and this provides the framework for understanding emotional and cognitive tolls of abuse in cases where victims do resort to extreme actions as a response to their circumstance, which is, in this context, Ruth shooting her husband. And that's why we kind of have this other kind of idea, which is learned helplessness, which is part of BWS, which explains how individuals who are subjected to this repeated inescapable trauma then develop pervasive belief that they are powerless to change their situation, which I actually do not think applies to Ellis in this case, because she did think that she was empowered to change her situation. She did recognize, I'm in a situation that I want to get out of.
Definitely.
This is something that I do not want to stay in. This is not something that makes me happy.
She knew it was wrong.
She knew it was wrong, and she did this is why there are arguments speculating whether this is right or not, because she did think that she was powerful, entitled to change her situation, and that's why she did shoot him. And victims with BWS often do endure abuse because there are no other viable alternatives due to social, financial, economic constraints. But I think Ellis's repeated exposure to this kind of pushed her to try to break the kind of norm, break the ideals around this. And I just thought that was so interesting. What could have fueled her? What could have motivated her? What was she thinking at the time? If only I could have known, only this is more recent, or if only she was still alive, we could actually know what was going through her head at the time. So, her repeated exposure to physical and emotional violence with the societal pressures created this psychological environment where rational decision-making was impaired, which did lead her to take such an extreme to shoot her husband, which is shocking, of course, but I think this really does explain it. And then, of course, Ellis's familiarity with Blakely's outbursts may have caused her to live in constant fear of escalation, especially during moments of conflict. And then the shooting incident could have been interpreted as preemptive, like an anticipated response to something that she thought was coming. Maybe she felt like she was endangered in this relationship. Maybe she felt like she was at risk of Blakely doing something bigger to her, something he wasn't going to do. Maybe she was mainly thinking in a very defensive way, which, again, extremely progressive, because no woman was thinking about themselves. No woman at this time was really going to think, how am I going to defend themselves? How am I going to defend myself? So, yeah, that's basically the psychology behind it. I hope you enjoyed learning a bit about IPV and BWS. And, yeah, let's move on to the law section now.
So now let's get into the moment we have all been waiting for, the trial, you guys. Okay, this is a very interesting trial. I hope you guys are ready to learn a bit about the 1950s English legal system. So just for everyone, I'm going to give you a little overview. The defendant was Ruth Ellis. She was the nightclub hostess. The victim was David Blakely. He's deceased, but he was her abusive lover. The crime was murder. Ellis shot Blakely outside a pub in Hampstead. The trial was held at Old Bailey, and Ellis was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. She was the last woman hung in Britain. She was executed on July 13th, 1955. Keep in mind, the case was in April 1955. Very quick trial, right, guys? She became the last woman to be hung in the UK. Right. Let's go into the legal dimensions. So, firstly, Ellis had admitted to shooting Blakely, which meant that there was premeditation. Under English law at that time, this clear admission of guilt, admission of murder, satisfied the requirements for a murder conviction. It was enough evidence. However, there was no legal defense such as diminished responsibility or provocation was argued effectively. Despite evidence of an abusive relationship and her mental distress, no one produced the evidence that there clearly was to save her side. The law on provocation, which is now replaced by the loss of control defense, required evidence that the defendant lost control due to the victim's actions. The jury did not view Ellis's actions as a response to provocation, so they didn't think what Ellis did was because of the abuse, despite the fact that he clearly was abusive. Also, modern frameworks If this case had taken place today, it may have allowed Ellis to plead diminished responsibility or self-defense due to her abuse, but these were unavailable in 1955. Nobody believed that self-defense was a thing. I mean, you killed your husband. You admitted to it. You're guilty. You should be hung. There's absolutely no thing we can do about it. Yeah, there may have been evidence, but we're not going to use it because you admitted to it, and that's enough.
I mean, yeah, I guess.
So, at the time, the death penalty for murder was mandatory unless there was reprieve granted. And the jury's recommendation for mercy was even disregarded by the Home Secretary. So, if you kill someone, you'd also get killed. So, now let's go into my favorite part, how the gender and systematic inequalities impacted the outcome. So, Ellis was portrayed as a fallen woman. She was working in a nightclub. She was a hostess, and her tumultuous relationship with Blakely likely prejudiced the court and public opinion. They all thought she was just some, excuse my language, prostitute. She was just a provocative woman who, yeah, she got into a bad relationship, but so be it. She had no right to shoot her husband.
Yikes.
And that's what they thought of her. Society's expectations of women at the time as well, particularly in a post-war masculine Britain, emphasized domesticity and moral virtue. I mean, Ellis's defiance of these norms further contributed to harsher judgment. How dare she defend herself? That just was unheard of at the time. Domestic abuse ignored. Ellis suffered physical abuse from Blakely. She had a miscarriage because of how violent he was to her, you guys.
Oh my God.
This context was ignored during the trial. There was a systematic failure to consider abuse as a factor. Just because she was a woman and just because she wasn't a very elegant woman, she worked at a nightclub, she was seen as the violence didn't matter. She had no right to shoot him. There was also class bias as well. She was a working class background. She wasn't that rich, and her lack of access to high quality legal representation also meant she couldn't adequately present her evidence of her abuse or argue for her mental state or the fact that it was like self-defense. So the impact this had on the legal outform and reform. So there was a public outcry. After Ellis's execution, there was widespread debate about the death penalty and its disproportionate application, particularly to women and marginalized groups. Many viewed this case as an example of excessive punishment, which was exacerbated by systematic gender and class discrimination. They thought that there's absolutely no reason to take someone's life, no matter what they have done, because you are basing it on the fact that they are poor, that they are black, that they are darker skinned, that they're a woman. They're basing it off of these systematic inequalities, which is absolutely not fair. So no wonder that there was public outcry. Also, you guys are going to actually think that this is extremely important, as so do I. Her execution was one of the reasons that the controversy surrounding it was one of the reasons that there was a movement that was growing to abolish capital punishment in the UK. And it was, you guys, in 1965, 10 years later, the death penalty was abolished in the abolition of death penalty. So I'm just going to end with the fact that the Ruth Ellis case underscores the profound impact of gender and systematic inequalities on the criminal justice system. I mean, her trial and execution reveal a failure to account for abuse, societal biases, and the rigid application of the death penalty. This case remains a critical lens through which to examine justice, equity, and the enduring consequences of systematic prejudice in the legal system. As well as that, this case just teaches us a bit about society at the time, as well as the trial and how the legal system was like back in Britain in the 1950s. So that's all from the law side, the law aspect, and thank you guys so much for tuning in this week.
Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed learning a bit about this case and a bit of a history lesson with that too, learning about the 1950s UK legal system and learning a bit about the actual psychology behind abusive relationships and how love can turn violent. And yeah, we hope you all enjoyed, and yeah, stay tuned for next month's episode.
Thank you so much, guys. Bye.
Bye.